Holy God, we live in the midst of troubled times. We are so aware of violence that we don't know reasons for, and of contentiousness and all kinds of things happening in this broken world. And so I give you thanks for this group of folks, for this opportunity for us to learn a little about people different from us, to learn some about another religion. I ask that as we do that learning, you will open our hearts and our minds, help us to grow in our own faith, and also to be good brothers and sisters to those who believe differently than we do. I give you thanks for John and his willingness and knowledge. I pray all these things in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen.
Amen.
Just a reminder, if you missed any sessions, you can always find them online, and we're very grateful to Anne and to Rachel for all of their helpful technology that they're doing. So, here we are.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for coming tonight. So tonight, what I want to do is I want to focus mostly on, I want to look at Muhammad in terms of Jesus. I want to think about what Jesus means for Christians, and then talk about Muhammad. And then do the same with the Bible. I want to talk about what the Bible means for us, and then talk about what the Quran means for Muslims. I'm also going to be talking a little bit about Hadith literature, which is another kind of writing that's actually just as important, maybe even more important than the Quran to Muslims. So that's going to be the focus. I need to start off by correcting myself from last week. As my friend pointed out, rabbis are, they do go through an ordination process in Judaism. What I was confused about was trying to explain is that the meaning of ordination is different among different Christians. So what I was thinking mostly about here is that for a priest to be ordained, like Anne, it has a different meaning in the Episcopal Church than it does in the Baptist Church. So Episcopalians and Catholics and Lutherans and Presbyterians, when you're ordained, it means that you're able to consecrate certain things. So you can't really do the Lord's Supper in a Presbyterian church or an Episcopal church unless there is an ordained clergy blessing the wine and the bread. In the Baptist church, anyone can do it. So I'm an ordained Baptist, but that it doesn't mean that I have any particular special quality. And that's really, I think that's the way we would probably think of ordination in Judaism in general. So a rabbi doesn't have some other, when you're an ordained rabbi, there are certain things that you can do. But the synagogue can go through all of its functions without a rabbi, I think.
That's pretty true. But the ordination, when they're up there on what we call a bima.
Right.
Okay.
Platform.
That classic thing that Spock did in the Trekkies thing? Well, apparently he picked that up from his bar mitzvah. I don't know why he would do it. But anyway, they're laying the hands on. This is something that is considered to be from almost Abraham through Moses. They just have a sense that it's a continuous line, and they're carrying forth this religious calling and what it means.
Right. All Christian denominations take that same approach. Baptists, we lay hands with that idea that there's some continuous line. What I was trying to say is that the meaning of ordination in Judaism, the rabbi, you're ordained, so that means you can can serve in certain kinds of legal capacities.
Yes.
So in a Jewish setting, you can make legal rulings within a Jewish community. Now, the most relevant, I think, was for Islam. In Islam, there's nothing like ordination in Islam. So an imam probably is somebody who's smart. He's trained. He's gone to school. Usually in the United States, imams are trained in either Saudi Arabia or Egypt. I don't think I've ever met anyone from other countries. Saudi Arabia invites people to come and study and then go back and become imams. I think there's some similar ideas. But it's very, very important in Islam that all people are equal, that all people are the same. So Islam does not want to give the idea that some people sort of are closer to God or something like that. Islam is very, very, very emphasizes very strongly that all people are equal. I think I was trying to show that a little bit yesterday and so last week. So the idea of ordaining, and the other thing I was trying to explain is that what gets complicated is that in the United States, we've kind of figured out laws, and we sort of figured out a relationship between the government and religion, thinking about Christianity. That's sort of how we kind of developed our culture and our way of thinking. And so, yes, we have freedom of religion. So Jews can practice Judaism, and Muslims can practice Islam, and Hindus can practice Hinduism, but they have to sort of figure out how to make their religious structures sort of work in an American context. So that's why there might be a way for an imam to get some special treatments. It has to do with things like tax law, or possibly other things. So you have to sort of different religions kind of have to fit what they're doing into sort of an American way of thinking. So I may talk a little bit about that next week. So yes, so Christians, most denominations, not all denominations, ordain clergy. Judaism, yes, Judaism ordains rabbis. Islam, there's no ordination. But even in Judaism and the Baptist Church, ordination, we don't think of it as ordination as making one person sort of closer to God or able to consecrate things so much as you might do in the Episcopal Church. All right. Okay. So let's now move on to this. But thank you very much for pointing it out last week. Okay. So okay. I'm gonna try that. I forgot this one. Oh, great. Okay, so I want to start off by talking about Jesus, and I was thinking a little bit about the meaning of Jesus. What is Jesus to Christians? Why is Jesus important for Christians? What is the relationship between Jesus and our what we call Christianity? First of all, most Christians believe that Jesus was God on earth. Jesus was the Son of God, and was God himself, and is part of the Trinity. So even though Jesus was a man, in traditional classic Christianity, Jesus is fully human in every way, somehow he's also God. So that's the first thing. Secondly, he's the means by which, I wrote it here, by which humankind finds peace with God, or we might use the word salvation. So whatever it is that humans have to do to be okay with God, being saved or being reconciled, it's through Jesus. It's basically through his death on the cross. So for us to be okay with God, Christianity teaches it has to be through Jesus, through his death, and our acceptance of that. Third thing is that Jesus is a model of human behavior. There's a famous passage in Paul's letter to the Philippians, where he tells Christians to approach God kind of in the spirit of Jesus, who humbled himself, kind of turned away from his divinity and sought to be a man so that he could serve God. And so we look to Jesus as our example. Jesus is a perfect human being, and we should try to imitate Jesus. And the fourth one is that he's the most important human teacher. And not only that most of his ministry in the New Testament and Gospels is him teaching, but that he is the inspiration and the main character of the New Testament. So Jesus, interestingly, he doesn't write anything. He's not credited with writing anything at all. But he is the person sort of behind the New Testament. So I don't know if anyone can think of other particular things, but I think most of what we think about when we think about Jesus falls into these four basic categories. Now, what's important is that, now we want to think about the origins of Islam. So Islam starts in something like the 7th century, 7th century of the Common Era. And so these Arabs have a number of Jewish people living with them, and they're very, very familiar with Christianity from Christian missionary activity. And they really like the idea of what we call ethical monotheism. They like the idea that there is only one God, and that God is perfectly powerful and perfectly loving and perfectly just. So they really go for that idea. And religions that teach that, that's Judaism and Christianity. But as I've explained a couple of weeks ago, the problem with Christianity is that they can't really wrap their minds around this sort of Jesus guy who is somehow in a way that nobody can fully explain. Jesus is human and God. And then there's also this Trinity idea. So the early Muslims tend much more, kind of lean much more to a Jewish way of thinking about things. So if we're going to talk about one figure, what Islam tries to do is it sort of gets rid of these first two ideas, and instead comes up with somebody who is a model of human behavior, and I use this term exemplar, and then the most important human teacher. And so when we talk about Muhammad, that's the importance of Muhammad to Islam, that he is a model of human behavior and that he's the most important human teacher. So again, even Muhammad, I said that imams are no different than other Muslims. Even Muhammad is equal to everybody else. He just happens to be the person who was the best person who ever lived. So he's a model of human behavior, and he's the most important human teacher. And I mentioned that Jesus, in our Christian idea, Jesus doesn't write the New Testament. Muhammad, however, recites, he speaks the entire Quran. And it gets written down because people are listening to him, that they're writing tablets, and they write it down, and it gets assembled later on. And he's also the main character in most hadith, which is the second kind of literature that I'll be talking about later on. So, now here's the thing, now using this term exemplar, exemplar is kind of a technical religious word. It's the person that we're supposed to imitate. And I want to think a little bit more about Jesus. So Christians, we understand that we are supposed to imitate Jesus. But I say when I teach my religion classes and in other contexts that as exemplars go, lots of religions have an exemplar, that one person that we're supposed to imitate. As exemplars go, Jesus is not very good. And the reason for that is that we know, well, two reasons. First of all, we know very, very little about him. The Gospels don't really tell us all that much about what he did. So if we we want him to be our example. Well, we don't have a teenage Jesus. We don't have Jesus. We don't have anything about Jesus when he was a carpenter. I mean, there's a tiny little references to that. Jesus wasn't married. Now, most of us are married. So if we want to look to Jesus as what a good husband should be or a good wife should be, that's hard to do. Muhammad, on the other hand, is one of the best exemplars in any religion because there is a long biography. So Muhammad was a husband. So he was a model husband. We can kind of look to him and figure out how to be good husbands, us guys. He was a father. He was an employee. He worked for somebody. He was a statesman. The last 12 years of his life, he's more or less the mayor or mayor of Medina, the kind of leader of a community. He was a military leader. He was a teacher. So Islam, I think, sees that the idea of the main guy being an exemplar, that's a good idea. And so Muhammad in Islam becomes that exemplar. He has a nice long biography. So we can actually look to stories of Muhammad and see what he actually did, and then maybe he can be the example for Muslims. Now, the main source of information about Muhammad's life is something that's called the Rasul al-Sirat, or the Sirah. So every biography of Muhammad actually comes down to this work. It was put together, I think around 200 years after Muhammad died. So even Muslims don't necessarily swear that everything in the Sirah is historically correct. And religion scholars, historians, find it very hard to really confirm much of anything in the Sirah. But it's a long kind of compilation of stories about Muhammad, different parts of his life. And so Muslims understand that it doesn't quite reach the level of the Quran, what we would call scripture. But you read it and you at least learn, or you read it and you get a sense of who Muhammad was, and he's able to be a true example for Muslims. So they use this book. I think I got this. All right, I'm not going to talk about this. Let me move to the next slide. I may have to switch the slides. All right. Muhammad and Islamic teaching. So the other thing Muhammad does is that he is he's the one that puts together the Quran. So what he does, the last 22 years of his life, he listens. What happens is the angel Gabriel comes to Muhammad and speaks words. And Muhammad listens to the words, and then Muhammad repeats them, and then other people write them down. The way Muslims look at Jesus is that Jesus was a prophet, was a great prophet, a very, very important prophet. But the New Testament can't be relied on because it didn't come straight from Jesus. The New Testament came through other people. Right? So the New Testament was written basically by Jesus' disciples or close friends of Jesus' disciples. And so what Muslims would say is that the disciples were good guys. They were doing their best. His associates were good guys also doing their best. But they didn't quite rise to the level of Jesus. Right? Most Christians would say the same thing. And therefore, sometimes their biases would get in the way. Sometimes they'd make mistakes. Sometimes they just wouldn't quite understand what it was that Jesus was saying or doing. And that's why the New Testament isn't quite good enough. The New Testament is good, but because it's not directly the words or teachings of Jesus. There are all these problems. So even, in your red letter Bible, even though a lot of the Gospels are, the words of Jesus, even there, Muslims would say, okay, even the Gospels, they're written many years later, and they're transmitted by people who might not have quite understood exactly what Jesus was saying or doing. So the Quran is much better because it is directly Muhammad's words. There's no intermediary. Muhammad's just speaking, and it gets written down right away. So that's why the Quran is better than the Bible. I'll talk about the Hadith in a minute. All right. Now this is very important, and I'll explain why in a little while. But let me do this here. When I teach Islam, when I teach religion, I make my students memorize a lot more than this. But it's very important when we talk about the Quran to think about Muhammad's life. And the way Muhammad's life works is that just about every year in his life, from 595 onward, something significant happens, something momentous or important happens. Let me just briefly go through this. So Muhammad usually it's reported that he lived from 570 to 632. And so in 595, he's 25, and he marries Khadija. Now, let me just start off. Muhammad is born, his parents died by the time he's 4 years old. So he's born to one of the, probably the most important tribe in Mecca, but it's sort of an unimportant part of that tribe. So it's an important tribe, but he's not particularly well off himself. And his parents died by the time he's 4 years old. So he doesn't have the easiest childhood. He has to work very hard, and he works hard, and people think very well of him. When he's 25, he marries Khadija. Khadija is rich and a widow. What that means is that he doesn't have to work quite so hard. And what he does, he starts to spend time in the mountains, kind of looking around for God, trying to see God, to hear from God. And then in the year 610, he's 40 years old, and this is where he first hears from God. So the earliest parts of the Quran come from this first encounter. In the year 613, so after 3 years, he spends 3 years not teaching in public, just listening to God and sharing what God is telling him with just a very, very few friends. He shares it with his wife, Khadija, and a few other people, and they become Muslim. In 613, he begins public preaching. What he's doing now is he's still in Mecca, and he's kind of trying to persuade people that he's hearing the truth. He's trying to persuade people basically to become monotheists, to listen to the one God instead of other gods. There's a lot of opposition, a lot of difficulty. There's also some success. Some people are becoming Muslim. I talked about the Mirage in the first week, and I mentioned that the Mirage is important because this is an event where God makes it very clear that Muhammad is the most important of all the prophets. So just to review that, the Mirage, one night Muhammad is miraculously transported 500 miles from Mecca to Jerusalem, and then he rises from Jerusalem to heaven, meets meets a number of the prophets from the Bible, including Jesus and Abraham and Moses and John the Baptist and others. They all agree that Muhammad is the most important of the prophets. And then he comes back and goes back. The year 622 is very important. This is what we call the Hijra. And this is where the Muslim community starts. So Islam starts with the Muslim calendar begins. Year 1 is this moment, because this is when we first finally have a Muslim community. It's not a minority in Mecca. but instead it becomes the main community in Medina. So sets up a Muslim community in Medina. In 630, he's able to return to Mecca, and then he dies in 632. Now, it's interesting that he marries Khadijah right at the age of 25, and then right at the age of 40 is when he first hears from God. And then after 3 years, he first does this public preaching. So religion scholars and historians look at this and they say, it looks really kind of neat and clean, the years like that. And it actually helps Muslims to sort of remember what's going on in his life. So it kind of works to a purpose. By the way, there are lots of books out about the historical Jesus, about how historians look at Jesus and that sort of thing. Actually, the information that we have about Jesus, we actually have more information about the historical Jesus than the historical Muhammad. It's very hard for scholars really to figure out much of anything about Muhammad's life. Scholars agree that there was a Muhammad who lived sort of around this time. There's very little that we can actually say is true about Muhammad. We can actually say a little bit more about Jesus. The information about Jesus is a little bit better. What's important, though, is not the historical information that we can verify, but what Christians and Muslims do with that information, or how we interpret it. And so this scheme is really, really important, and I'll explain why in a couple of minutes. All right, now moving on to the Bible and the Quran. So what I did here is I thought a little bit about some basic principles of interpretation. I mentioned in the first week that if you want to know what Christians believe, reading the Bible from Genesis to Revelation, kind of sitting and reading through it, is not really a very good strategy. You're not going to figure out Christian practice or even central Christian belief just by reading the Bible straight through. I mean, part of it is that Christians have developed all kinds of principles for interpretation. I've just listed a few things that most Christians more or less agree on, even though we might disagree how to apply everything. So Christians would usually say that the New Testament supersedes the Old Testament. The Old Testament says one thing, the New Testament says another thing. Go with the New Testament. We say that Old Testament promises to Abraham and his descendants become applied to the church. Now, there's lots of debate and discussion about to what extent this is true. But in the Old Testament, we see that God is basically interested in Abraham and his descendants, Israel. God has this relationship with this particular people. And for us as Christians to kind of say that the Old Testament is still Scripture, it's still something Christians should read and believe, that means that we kind of sort of have to make this connection. That when God is talking to Israel in the Old Testament, that more or less applies to the church in the New Testament. And again, the extent to which we follow that idea or apply that, we debate quite a bit. In the Old Testament, Christians talk about ritual law. So most Christians are very happy to eat shrimp, even though the Old Testament forbids it. Christians, we don't do the sacrifices that Leviticus says you're supposed to do. Whenever we're talking about ritual law in the Old Testament, we're talking about rituals, things that you do in order to worship God. Christians basically dismiss them. There's some Christians that keep some of that stuff, but basically we just don't pay attention to that. So, we have to think about the historical context. So, for example, even in the New Testament, there are passages that seem to say that slavery is fine. There are lots of passages in the New Testament that say that men are much more important than women, or men should be running things and women should not be. So we come to passages like that. Usually we've come up with ways of kind of making sure that we read those in some sort of historical context, that we can say, yes, Christians oppose any kind of white supremacy. Christians affirm that women can do things, that do things just as well as men, most of us. All right. Okay, no, not all that. All right. Now, the Quran, what you do with the Quran is, since Muhammad is speaking the Quran, it's very important to put the Quran in context of Muhammad's life. That was the reason. That's the reason that that Muslims think that's the reason that Muslims learn this and really have to learn this, because from the year 610 onward, and most of the Sirah actually talks about Muhammad after the year 610. From the year 610 to 632, Muhammad is receiving revelations from God all through that 22-year period. And so what we do with the Quran is we try to put a Quranic passage and situate it within whatever was going on in Muhammad's life. And there are three main divisions, and we call them the early Meccan period. So the first division, early Meccan period. So Muhammad is first receiving revelations from God, but he's not really telling too many people. He's telling only a very, very few close associates. And in this period, we see the Quran is making basically general statements about God and about human beings. And kind of things like human beings have to understand that there's only one God, and we have to obey Him. And we have to try to be kind to people generally. Try to be kind and understanding. In the year 613, God tells Muhammad to start preaching. And so now Muhammad is involved in, I would say maybe we might even call it debates. He's trying to convince people that, first of all, everyone needs to be a monotheist. Everyone has to worship the one God. There's only one God out there. And he's also trying to show that he is the greatest and the last of the prophets. And so a lot of this is reinterpretation of Bible teaching. An awful lot of the Bible reappears in the Quran. And what the Quran does, it takes Bible passages and it kind of reworks them a little bit in order to show basically that all of the prophets are more or less like Muhammad. Maybe not quite as good, but more or less like Muhammad. And it tries to show that all of the Bible prophets are basically teaching the same thing. Now, as a Bible scholar and a Christian, I think most of you might agree with me that in the Bible characters are all different. They all have different personalities. They all have different strengths and weaknesses. They all do all kinds of different things. The Quran tries to show that actually all of the prophets, more or less, are the same. They're all very, very, very interested in ethical monotheism. They're very interested in teaching people to worship only one God and to try and do what He says. So Quran is reinterpreting this and kind of doing it in a way to show that everyone is like Muhammad, just not quite up to Muhammad's level. In the last period, from 632 to 622 to Muhammad's death, now Muhammad is the head of the Muslim community. Now he has a responsibility to sort of, you have to make rules. Once you have a community, then you sort of have to figure out how God's word actually applies to real people. So we see rules and regulations for the community. All right. And so when we read the Quran is not in any kind of chronological order. It's not really in I think, any sort of order at all. So, and it tends to be, very often the Medinan period revelations tend to be near the front. And the early Meccan period stuff tends to be towards the back. And it can be a little bit frustrating, and what the scholars do is they sort of try to debate and sort of figure out which period it goes to. One of the issues is that when the Quran disagrees with itself, the idea is that maybe God came up with something earlier, but we have to listen to whatever develops later. So sort of in Christianity, right, the Bible might disagree with itself, but we say, okay, the New Testament supersedes the Old. In the Quran, we would say that things that appear to have come from the Medinan period would supersede stuff that comes from the other periods. But anytime we're reading the Quran, or anytime Muslims reading the Quran, we have to try to think about how to fit the Quran into the life of Muhammad. And I'm going to say just a couple more things about the Quran. So now, one of the maybe helpful things about the Quran is that there's really one central message that gets repeated over and over again in the Quran. In the Bible, we have to deal with all kinds of different literature. In a Sunday school or Bible study, you might hear people talk about different genres, right? So the Bible has these stories, but also has poetry. It has law. It has kind of these proverb things that are sort of advice. It has letters, Paul's epistles, letters in the Old Testament. So there's all sorts of different genres. And everyone is writing with a kind of different idea, or sometimes it seems to be a very, very different message. In the Quran, there's really one central message that gets repeated over and over again. And this is actually pretty easy to find in the Quran. These are some basic things that the Quran stresses over and over and over again. There's only one God, created the world, and he's perfectly powerful, loving, and just. He looks exactly like the God of the Bible, except that there's no Trinity, nothing like that. The primary duty of human beings is to submit to God. Our main duty is to obey God. And the difficulty with humans is nothing like original sin. The difficulty is that human beings are often distracted. So we become interested in pleasure or needs or desires, and we're not necessarily so bad, but because we get distracted by other things, by things that we see on earth, we sort of get off the beaten track. God is merciful, and in God's mercy, he sends prophets and scriptures to steer humans back to worshiping God. So God sent Abraham to try to get people to go back to worship him. Now, for example, in the Old Testament, Abraham is an individual kind of wanders around Israel, and he's important because he has children and descendants, and he's kind of the founder of a new class of people. In the Quran, Abraham is someone who teaches monotheism. Abraham destroys idols. There's a famous story from the Talmud where Abraham destroys idols in an idol shop. So in the Quran, Abraham is not so important, not just because he's the father of a group of people, but because he's a preacher teaching monotheism. Moses is a prophet, according to Islam. And Moses writes the Old Testament. So the Old Testament, or the Torah, the Pentateuch, that's the scripture that God sent. The New Testament, these are also scriptures that God sent to human beings to try to get them on the right track. So in God's mercy, he, throughout history, right up until Muhammad, he sends prophets and scriptures in order to get people back to the place where they're supposed to be. And those Those that submit to God go to heaven. I sent the wrong thing. I corrected it. It's not go to evil, they go to heaven. The Quran actually talks an awful lot more about... the Quran talks a lot more about heaven and hell than the Bible. There's a much more vivid description. So if you submit to God, if you repent, if you change your way, you go to heaven, and if you don't, then you go to hell. There's not this kind of idea that there needs to be a sacrifice or anything like that in order to be okay with God. All you have to do to be okay with God is to do what He says. If you've done things wrong, yes, you repent. You say, God, I'm sorry, I did things wrong, and God is able to forgive you. So it's a very simple, very simple concept. You obey God, you do your best, and you're in. And if you decide not to, then you're maybe you're out. Okay, I didn't do what I wanted. All right. So let me talk a little bit about. I'm talking about creeds because I want to talk about it deep. So we want to think about why we actually have creeds. Why do we have the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed? Now, this is very important, especially for a Baptist, because I believe in the Bible. I follow the Bible, and the creeds, the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, the Chalcedonian Confession, things like this. They may be important, but they're not the Bible. And the church has never put the creeds on the same level as the Bible. So if we have the Bible, why is it that we use creeds? Why do we say the Nicene Creed every week at St. Andrews? Why do people recite the Apostles' Creed? And the reason is that the creeds spell out the doctrines. They spell out what it is that we believe. And that's why these creeds were developed. Because we want to know exactly what we're supposed to believe in order to be a Christian. The ideas and the doctrines in the creeds are sometimes very hard to actually find in the Bible. I don't know that anyone, frankly, could read the Old Testament and the New Testament and come up with the doctrine of the Trinity on their own. That's really a very hard one to piece together. And that's why it took the church really about 300 years to put it together. But if you recite the Nicene Creed, it's there. So we use creeds and confessions to explain what it is that we believe. So what unites us is these beliefs that we have in the creeds. That's why Christianity developed the creeds. In order to make the ideas, the essential ideas, the important ideas, the things that make us Christians, to make them to state them very clearly in a way that we can all put together, that we can all read and easily understand and put together. Okay, so the Hadith works something like the creeds. The Quran itself is very hard to understand. I was talking about the pillars of practice last week, and there's no place in the Quran that says there are 5 pillars of practice and here's what they are. Muslims believe that they have to follow the pillars, but it's very hard to get from the Quran to the pillars. But just like Christians, we talk about the Trinity, we talk about salvation in Jesus Christ, but it's actually tricky to get from the New Testament to the Trinity. It's hard to get from the New Testament to salvation. The Hadith make it very, very easy. So the Hadith, they're supposed to be words of Muhammad and his associates, and what they're transmitted orally. So Muhammad tells his associates, they tell other people, and they get written down about 200 years later. Sayings and teachings. There's thousands of these hadith around. There's collections of them. And their authenticity is measured according to the chain of transmissions. Every hadith has a list of people who repeated the hadith over centuries. And what Muslim scholars do, they spend an incredible amount of time doing, is trying to figure out the authenticity of hadith based on the chain of transmission. The reason it is this last thing. If we can prove that a hadith is actually came from Muhammad, and that it was written down in the same way that it was spoken in the first place, then it is just as authoritative as the Quran. So a hadith has the same level of authority as the Quran, as long as we can be sure that the hadith is authentic. I'm not sure how Christians might disagree if we would about saying the same thing about the creeds. Is the Apostles' Creed, is that the same level of authority as the Gospel of John? The Nicene Creed, is that just as true as what we read in the letter to the Romans? I'm not sure. I'm a Baptist, I would have to say no. But other Christians may think other things. So in Islam, if we can show that an hadith is authentic, then even though it's not in the Quran, it is equal in authority to the Quran. Okay, so this is the most famous, the most important hadith. This is just actually the start of it. I just want you to see what it's like. So Umar ibn al-Khattab, Umar was one of Muhammad's favorite closest associates. He was the second caliph so the second leader of the Islamic community after Muhammad died. So it's coming from Umar. Umar is about as good as you're going to get in the Muslim community. So he said, one day we were with God's messenger, that's Muhammad, and a man with very white clothing and very black hair came up to us. The mark of travel was visible upon him. None of us recognized him. Sitting down before the prophet, leaning his knees against his and placing his hands on his thighs, he said, "Tell me, Muhammad, about submission." And Muhammad replied, "Submission means that you bear witness that there's no God but God, and Muhammad is God's messenger, that you should perform the ritual prayer, pay the alms tax, fast during Ramadan, make the pilgrimage to the house if you're able to go there." So with Muhammad, what happens is this person is revealed to be, at the end of the hadith, the angel Gabriel, kind of looking like a human being. Comes up to Muhammad, asks him about submission, and Muhammad recites the 5 pillars of Muslim practice. So it's all clear and neat and easy to understand in one paragraph. You cannot find anything like that at all in the Quran, but it's all nice and neat here. And it's kind of like what happens in the Apostles' Creed. Now, this hadith goes on. It's not terribly long, but it goes on a little bit more. And the angel asks him about what it is that Muslims are supposed to believe and what's supposed to happen in the future. It's important that the angel starts with submission. He begins with what you're supposed to do, because for Muslims, what you're supposed to do is the most important thing. So you can find this online, the Hadith of Gabriel. Again, it's probably the single most important hadith, and it's useful because it puts everything together nice and neat. And that's what the hadith tends to do. Okay. I'm sorry. I'm going to have to send you another thing before I go. Okay, I think that's that's pretty much it. So just to summarize, Muhammad is important in Islam, but Muslims insist that he is human. He's as human as anybody else. So he is important as the model human being. Not quite perfect, but if we want to imitate someone, we imitate Muhammad. And there's a lot of tradition, a lot of stories about a man who lives a full life. And so there's a lot of things that we can imitate about him. The Quran and Hadith come directly from Muhammad. We can trust them because there's no intermediaries. There's no disciples who are less perfect, who maybe are accidentally inserting their ideas or making mistakes or things like that. It comes straight from Muhammad, and his words come straight from God. So that's what makes the Quran and the Hadith better than the Bible. The Quran is the Word of God. The Hadith, if we can show that some Hadith is authentic, then it is just as authoritative as the Bible. So something like the Hadith of Gabriel is just as authoritative. All right, any questions? Yes, sir.
Why would Gabriel ask Muhammad about submission? Is he just trying to get Muhammad to say it out loud because who wants there taking notes?
I think so. That's how I would understand it. Yeah. So Umar can say, yeah, I actually saw this. I saw Gabriel coming to Muhammad and asking when Muhammad said this, and so that's what I think. Yes, I think there's the performance. The performance of it. Maybe if you're reading this, maybe it makes it more meaningful for you. Maybe it makes it easier to relate to. Sure. So that's what I think. Yes.
In when you said the main ideas of the Quran, the fifth one you said was those who submit to God go to heaven, and those who don't go to hell.
Right.
I heard an evangelist this weekend at my church say that the Muslims were looking for the Messiah to come. Now, what are they? Are they first of all looking for the Messiah to come? And if they are, what is his place in the Muslim religion?
Okay, there's not a Messiah. I'm going to talk a little bit about Sunnis and Shia. The Shia, especially, they teach that there was an important figure who lived, I don't know, like the 13th century, who was a human being, a great human being, a teacher, and he kind of rose to heaven without dying, that he's going to return someday. He's not a Messiah, but I don't think Messiah is a great word. But he's going to return someday, and he's going to kind of fix everything. He's going to sort of do the kinds of things that we teach Jesus will do when he comes back. He's going to set everything in order, and we're going to have the day of judgment. So this is a kind of Shia idea. Now, what's interesting is that, especially in the 19th and 20th century, there have been a number of people who claim to be this guy. And so, for example, the Baha'i faith, has anyone heard of that? So what we'd say the founder of the Baha'i faith was a Shia Muslim who said, I'm the Mahdi, I'm this person. This guy's from Iran, so he's saying, I'm the Mahdi, and I have a new teaching. So the Baha'i faith is very, very similar to Judaism and Christianity and Islam, except that it kind of modernizes things. There was another one, there's a group I might not get to talk about, the Ahmadiyya Muslims, which is sort of a branch of Islam. It's another person. This person actually claims to be this Messiah figure and Jesus at the same time. So it kind of says that when Jesus was talking about coming back to earth, and the Shia talking about this Mahdi, I'm one and the same. I'm both of those people. And he begins a kind of different religious tradition. So the Shia believe that there's somebody coming back, but it's really not. It's not really quite Jews would call Messiah or Christians would call Jesus. So I think somebody's trying to simplify.
But the modern day Jews, they're still looking for the Messiah, is that correct?
Well, some of them are looking more actively than others.
Yeah, true.
Yes, right, yes. But I don't think, the Shia Muslim idea is similar, but it's not really the same. And again, most Muslims are not Shia. Most Muslims are Sunni, and the Sunnis, there's some Sunnis that sort of gravitate to this, but most Sunnis are not interested in it. So, yes.
How was it determined which hadith are authentic?
Yeah, I was talking about that a little bit. So with every hadith, there's a chain of transmission. Who said it first, and then who he spoke to, then who that person spoke to, and who that person spoke to, and so on. And what these guys do in Saudi Arabia is they go into the biographies of these different people and try to figure out who is reliable, who we can count on to actually say the hadith exactly as was spoken. So it's a big field of study in places in Saudi Arabia and that sort of in Muslim environments. So yeah.
Is an imam paid by the mosque he's associated with, or has he got to have a day job?
If the mosque can afford it, sure. I mean, it's helpful for a mosque, like any organization, to have some full-time guy who's there and knows what he's doing. So if a mosque can afford it, none of the mosques here in Hampton Roads can afford it or want to spend that amount of money. But sure. So just like the church, right? Some churches can't afford a full-time person. Yes.
This might seem like a kind of off-the-side question, but for some reason, I seem to remember that I learned that the Shia and the Sunni were actually from two children of Muhammad. The children sort of, the followers of one of his sons went one way, and the followers
it's nothing to do. There's nothing racial about it.
And I'm absolutely wrong. I wondered about it.
I'll talk about it later. There's stories about the origins, which people talk about a lot. But for me, that's not all that important. But for me, what's important is the different beliefs. But yeah, there's origin stories. It doesn't have to do with it doesn't have to do with race or who's descended from who. It has to do with figuring out who's supposed to be in charge, basically. So.
Well, it was a son and not a daughter, right?
Not even a son. Muhammad, for some reason, Muhammad doesn't have sons. He has daughters, but no sons.
Oh, really?
So,
okay.
Yeah.
Do they believe that God is and always was? He was not created or anything.
Yeah, I think really just about pretty much exactly the way the Old Testament depicts God. So pretty much whatever the Old Testament says about God, the Quran says about God. I don't really think there's much of any difference between the Old Testament idea of God and the Muslim idea of God. The New Testament is where things get tricky.
And last week you were in the Hajj, you were talking about them spending time in the tent to remember where they came from and all.
You live in a tent through the Hajj.
Do they do this a particular time of the year? I'm thinking about the Feast of Tabernacles. Do they do this as a certain time of the year, like the feast in the Old Testament? Or?
Right. Okay. The Islam works on a lunar year. So the year the Muslim lunar year, it has fewer days than our year, which means that so it's the same time in the Muslim year every year that those dates shift. So it moves up about 15 15 days a year, kind of. So the Ramadan was in May and June this year. Next year, Ramadan's going to be entirely in May. So it's the same time in the Muslim lunar year, but the years are shorter. The lunar year means that they're going by phases of the moon. The moon changes phase every 28 days. And,
Do they celebrate the feast like the Jewish people do? Like the Feast of Tabernacles, like she was asking about. Do they do that? Is that why they're living in those tents?
No, that's not really why they're living in the tents. It's because you're moving around, you're doing different things. It's kind of the idea that we're all the same, and we want to be very simple when we're on the Hajj. Muslims recognize that the Hajj is it's difficult. You have to be in decent shape to undergo it. And Muslims say that if you're not healthy, you're not ready for that sort of thing, you're certainly not required to. So we're living simply for that week. We're traveling simply. We're recognizing that all human beings are equal. If you have more money, you shouldn't get more comfortable accommodation. If you don't have money, then the tent is all you're going to be able to afford anyway. So it's more about simplicity and equality that you're living in a tent during the Hajj than some other reason. Okay, any other questions? Okay, well, thanks very much. So next week I'm going to be talking about differences between Sunni and Shia, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about Muslim law. We have some coming? Okay. All right, well, okay, thanks very much. I'm going to revise this. I think I sent the wrong thing, but this was pretty much what I was going to do. So thanks very much.